Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Julie Mann and I show men and women how they can lead healthy, happy, sustainable lives. And I'm really delighted because today I'm joined by Jane Parslow. Hi Jane.
Hi Julie, lovely to be here.
Great to see you. Now, for those of you that don't yet know Jane, she works as a transitions coach. Now, we'll hear more about that a bit later on. And obviously, I'm going to put all her links below this interview. But I really want to start, Jane, with back when you were growing up. How was life when you were growing up? Can you tell us about that?
Oh gosh, that's the dim and distant past. I don't know. I look back and think quite often how grateful I am to have been born when I was. So yeah, it was a pretty easy childhood, really. I was good at school, in terms of being good at doing tests and things. Not always that well behaved. Yeah, I had friends really locally, spent a lot of time, this may be rose-tinted glasses, but lots of time in local parks with friends and lots of dogs and sort of running around in the summer holidays from dawn till dusk, really. So yeah, it feels like quite a privileged childhood, I think, in terms of not having to go through any particularly nasty events and having quite a lot of good ones.
Fantastic. So what kind of beliefs did you inherit growing up that you still hold to be true for you?
You don't hold back with the deep questions, do you? I guess lots of stuff about working hard and that you could achieve anything if you put your mind to it, I think. My mother was one of the very few women I knew who worked with young children. So I always had that as a role model that women could do just as much as men. And my mother was quite a sort of feminist pioneer, I think, used to fight very hard for her rights as a woman, if not all women's rights. So I guess that was a big thing for me, that I've never felt that I couldn't do well. Both my parents were in education in one way or another, so I guess a lot about the importance of education, and not just formal education. I'm a huge believer now in lifelong learning, but I guess those skills start, don't they, when you're still at school and are learning how to learn, and that you can do things wrong and still get better at it. Yeah, so I think a lot of stuff that I do live by now, I hope to, about equality and working hard and looking after other people who can't do as well as you, and the whole bit about learning. As I say, that's a thread through my whole life, I think, is the education.
How brilliant that she taught you that. You know, I guess there aren't many people that grow up with that philosophy, are there?
I suppose not. No, and maybe now, because obviously a lot more women work, but back then it was much more usual. If you hadn't stopped work or married, you certainly did when you had children. And to be fair, my mother did stop. I think my younger brother was 5 when she went back to work, so he'd started back at school. But she went off and got qualified and did a job she'd never done before. But it was also in little things. I remember she went once to try and get a store card for a local department store, and they wouldn't give her one without her husband's signature on the application form, if you can believe that. And that was really common back then. And she went, well, not absolutely nutty. She came up with a very, very good argument, actually, and persuaded them, and it went right up to the founder of the store to approve her card. And I think she still felt that as a failure, that she hadn't got it as a right for all women that wanted to do it. They just sort of made an exception for her. So just that sort of thing, I think that it was about not only seeing inequality, but standing up your rights and ideally other people's to make changes and make improvements that way.
What an extraordinary role model she was.
She was, yes. I miss her a lot for that.
Yeah. So we all face challenges, don't we, Jane? It's inevitable, isn't it, as we go through life. So what would you say has been the biggest challenge you have ever faced in your life?
Well, as I said, I sort of look back and feel that my life has been relatively easy. Obviously, there have been challenges, as I implied just now. My mother died when I was relatively old, I suppose. I was late 30s, but that's a challenge, isn't it, to overcome that sort of thing at whatever age you are. And a lot of the other challenges I've had, I guess, are positive ones. So when I was studying, I had a year abroad. And in fact, I'd chosen the course specifically because it gave everyone their third year away. But at 20, I guess, going off to live in another country, speaking another language, which was the point of it. And I hadn't picked the easiest country to go to, so I went to Moscow when it was still the Soviet Union. And that had some challenges around having to do it by yourself. I mean, communications were not that good. If I wanted to call home, which I only did 3 or 4 times in that year, it meant booking a call a week or 2 ahead and then trogging into the centre of town and hoping the call went through. So that was very much self-reliance and knowing that there wasn't much fallback if things went wrong, and that it was up to me to make the best of it that I could. And I have to say I had a fabulous year. So I guess, yeah, there have been things that challenged me, but not necessarily caused huge adversity and struggle, if you like. But then I guess that, you know, we've all been through work challenges, bereavements, things that stretch us. And I guess the key thing I've found is knowing that it will end. So I remember writing diary entries, you know, when I was 15, 16, awful things happening with friendships at school or boys ignoring me or whatever it was. But in my 20s, looked back and just howled with laughter at some of the notions in there. And I think that's what I kind of do now is, like, you know, at some point I will be looking back on this, whatever it is, and I will view it completely differently.
Absolutely, yeah. And I really want to come back to some of the things that you've just talked about. And I'm really curious, actually, because even though it sounded like, you know, you grew up with this mentality that you could do anything, and that you could overcome anything because of the way you learnt from your mother. If you were to give your younger self some advice right now, what might that be?
I guess to just keep going, that all the things that feel enormous when they're right there in front of you will not necessarily shrink, but certainly shift in perspective, you know, when you're looking back and seeing it as part of a bigger whole. And that you won't know that until you're through the other side. So really, you just have to kind of navigate as best you can. And obviously, there are ways that are more useful to get through those issues. I mean, you could just go to bed and wait for it all to wash over. But that there is something about perspective. And I guess that comes with age as well, is that you know, there's more to look back on and more context for
yeah.
And I don't want to diminish other people's experiences of this, because obviously there are some things that happen that I've been saved from so far, that are awful and are really, really difficult to keep going through. But that, as I say, perspective, I think, is what I would say to myself. That if it was one word, it's like, wait until you get some perspective on this and then judge it.
Yeah, which I guess you can only have from hindsight, can't you, really?
Yes. Although there are some coaching techniques where you can sort of imagine yourself into the future and looking back. So that would be one way of giving yourself a different perspective.
Yes, and that's an NLP technique, isn't it? Which I know that you're practicing. So going back to you traveling to Moscow, I mean, that was a massive deal, because how old were you, Jane?
I was 20, so it was part of my university course. So a lot of it was easy. I was set up with an exchange to go and work at a publishing house. So it wasn't like I had to find a job. That was all arranged. But yeah, it was a very different place and time then.
And what sort of time are we talking? What year was it that you I know that was actually a big deal for, you know, for women to travel alone and do that at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was the 70s, so 77 to 78 I was there. And I guess, you know, women, of course, were travelling. People were going on holiday, students would be backpacking around Europe. You know, it wasn't that unheard of. But I think it's certainly amongst the people I knew, Moscow was further than most people had been at the time, and fairly cut off, and such a different political situation, and therefore a different way of living as well.
Yes, yeah, amazing. How about you tell us your story, you know, what led you to doing what you absolutely love, you know, what you actually do now?
So, well, I'll spare you the full sort of life history, but various jobs, which ended up really in several decades in project management. So helping people and organisations implement change in one way or another. And that was training and consultancy, and again, more travel again. So that's been a theme. But I became increasingly aware, as I think everyone in project management does, that it's not about tools and techniques, that you can put a plan together in a variety of ways, and it may be a more or less realistic plan, but the key to making it work is to involve people, and you know, no deadline is going to be met unless people are committed to meeting it and helping you to meet it. So that led me really into increasing interest in how people work on their own and together in teams, how project managers can influence people, because quite often project managers don't have the authority that other managers have, that people work for them and they've recruited them and get to do their appraisals. So project managers are having to ask people to do things above and beyond their normal work with no control over that, how that happens. And that's what led me really to the NLP training you mentioned, and then into coach training. And the idea was to use that to help other project managers communicate better, to influence people, to get clear on outcomes and how they talk to people about that. And the coaching, again, fitted perfectly in that, because coaching really is about helping people through their personal projects. So projects are all about change, coaching is all about change, and using a kind of project management approach in coaching, or a coaching approach in project management, seemed like a really, really good fit to me. And I was noticing, and most people that came on my training courses, I suspect didn't really need full-on training. They already knew what to do and how to do it. What they were facing was a particular issue that they needed a bit of support with, and coaching seemed to fit better there than it did in, as I say, to training somebody in tools and techniques. So that shifted the way I did the training, I think, and a lot of coaching beliefs that people actually do have all the answers themselves. It certainly changed the way I did my training, and to some degree the consultancy, as well as opening the doors to helping people with coaching.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about coaching, isn't it? It's about asking really great questions that have people think, and then they come up with their own answers. And of course, people are much more likely to take action on their own answers.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, because I mean, I knew from training that I could advise people on the best way to do things, but they weren't going to do that just because I said so. I mean, you know, why would you? None of us do things just because somebody tells us to, or says, you know, I've got this great new idea. But yes, if it's our own idea and we know why it works and how we're committed to it, then we're much more likely to try it. And I mean, the other thing I find with my own coaching, I mean, being coached myself, is that if I've told somebody else I'm going to do it, I'm more likely to do it myself as well. Yeah. And that accountability side of coaching, I think, is really helpful.
Well, I think accountability is so key, isn't it, to change and to people being able to sustain something over a long period of time. It's really, really important. Yeah. Going back to Russian. Okay, so going back to being in Moscow. So I think you spent 4 years learning Russian, and some might think, Jane, that that's a really unusual choice. So why did you choose Russian?
Well, it actually goes back further than that. I'd studied it for quite a while before I even went to university. So my school offered a second language in your second or third year of senior school. I'm not sure how the years work now, but we did 1 year of French, and then in the second year we could choose Russian or German. And I think my thought process was that if I needed to learn German, I could probably do that later. You know, there were evening classes in German, or I could get to Germany or whatever. But Russian seemed like, you know, this might be the only chance I get to learn it. So chose that. And it turned out there were a few schools. There were maybe 7 or 8 schools in London that also offered Russian. So we'd all get together once a year. So yeah, I started it at school and carried on just because I like learning languages. And it seemed like when I got to university, a good one to have alongside something else. I wasn't too sure at that stage what work would be, but if I had a language, it seemed like a good idea to have a language and something else. So I ended up at university studying history with Russian as my sort of minor option. Right? And then it became a much bigger thing. This is most of my life, actually. Things sort of happen serendipitously, and you just grab the opportunity if you can. So I wasn't down to do a year in Moscow. I was going to go to Bulgaria and carry on learning Russian as a sort of second language. And then someone dropped out and I got their place in Moscow, which, as I said, was a great year. And we ended up, so 2 of us went, and we ended up working at a publishing house. So the day job, if you like, was checking translations into English of Russian works and proofreading, which is another skill that's been really useful throughout my life. Just being able to spot errors and typos before we had spell checkers to do it for us.
But you've got to be pretty good at Russian to be able to translate, surely.
Oh, I wasn't doing the translations. No, they had really important people with the translators. I was doing the proofreading. So after it had been translated and then set in print, we would come along and check for the typos. But we were the only 2 native English speakers in the building. The translators tended to work from home. So the editors who were Russian would tend to come to us to check that something had been translated correctly. And that was very funny, actually, because they would approach me and say, you know, why is this like this? Because it should be the subjunctive of the second person of, and I didn't know the grammar terms at all, but I would just say, but that's what an English person would say. That's all I know, is that sounds correct and would be passed as correct. And it may not follow the grammar rules, but so we would have these wonderful debates about the English language and how peculiar it is.
I imagine there were lots of causes for laughter over that.
There were, yes, yes. And it's interesting because the education in the Soviet Union was very, very good. So these people would know English grammar rules and know a lot of technical terms and other rather obscure words. That they would know it much better than I did. But I guess where we scored was we just knew what people would say and do, and what would sound right to a British ear.
Yeah, brilliant. And do you use your Russian now?
No, and that was a big regret, really. And when I came to graduate, a lot of the best jobs, so in the BBC, for example, and the Foreign Office and so on, a lot of those jobs were taken and people weren't going to leave them in a hurry, having got them. And by then, I think things like Chinese and Arabic had begun to take over in terms of demand. So needing a job, I moved away from it. I was absolutely delighted, though, about 10 years ago to get a job reviewing some project plans in Russia when my two bits came together. But that was rather terrifying. I guess that counts as a challenge because I'd forgotten all my Russian, had to go for some lessons. I'd never learned business Russian. It was all sort of conversational. So set off on a plane to a place quite a long way east of Moscow called Kazan. Really worried about whether I would be able to converse with project people in Russian and read the reports. And landed at the airport, heard people speak Russian, and it just unlocked something, and a lot of it came back. I mean, certainly enough to do the job. So yeah, that felt like, you know, I'd sort of picked up a dropped thread and managed to weave it back in. But I don't use it much now, I have to say.
Brilliant. So moving on to how you actually help people now. You say that you navigate their midlife transitions and discover how to make the best of the rest of their life. I absolutely love that expression. So firstly, Jane, I'm just really curious. What age is midlife, for starters? And what kind of transitions do you help people with?
Okay, well, I describe midlife quite broadly. So I think of it as 45 to 65-ish. I mean, obviously it's a sort of grey area either side of that. I've always had this notion, I think since my 30s, that middle age was about 10 years out from where I was at that stage. I think now I've reached the age I am, I kind of have to give up on that one. I'm the absolute upper end of that age range. So I'll be 65 this year. But I guess it comes down to how long you think we're going to live. And increasingly now, people are living into their 90s or even past 100. There's a huge number of people who are over 100 and still living healthily here. So 50 would be the midpoint, I guess. And I'm just sort of taking a view on life either side of that. But I guess it's, in terms of stage of life rather than actual ages, I would describe it as a time when most people have achieved their shoulds. You know, they've reached an age where they've paid off the mortgage, which we're all told we should do. We've probably got our children settled or at an age where we can see that they're on the path, reached particular points in our careers and jobs. And I think it is that stage of life where people, especially nowadays, can stop and reflect a bit. You know, I've got so far up the mountain, where have I got to, and do I still want to be climbing this mountain, or is there another one across the valley somewhere that might be a more interesting way to go? So I think it's a stage of life where we especially now when generally speaking we are living longer and we're living healthier for longer, which is the key thing, that we can look ahead and still see quite a chunk of our lives still to come. And this time round, rather than falling into a particular educational course as I did and then sort of luckily finding things to do, it feels like a time of life when we have a choice now, that we can, it's up to us to decide our path rather than have it formed by parents, teachers, pressures of life and so on. So in terms of the kind of things that people are looking at, the big one, I guess, is retirement, or increasingly nowadays trying to avoid retirement. You know, that I, for one, don't want to stop completely for a long time yet. So that I think occupation, let's call it, is, you know, what will I do when I'm 60 if I don't want to carry on doing what I'm doing now? And I think lots of people begin to feel the sort of the time limits, you know, that we may have 20 years left at 60. A lot of people do nowadays. But that, you know, that feels compressed, doesn't it? That we need to do something now if I'm going to do it for the next 20 years, as opposed to a 20-year-old for whom it feels like there's an infinite amount of time. So retirement's a big one. Empty nest syndrome. So again, we've got our kids settled, they're leaving now. What am I going to do that when I can't label myself anymore as a full-time parent or carer? Divorce, so 50s and 60s is the age group where divorce is still going up, when it's gone down or stayed stable in younger age groups. Becoming a carer for a relative, so again, that's what's happening to a lot of us as our parents get older and we get older. And then there's the sandwich generation, isn't there, where people are caring for an elderly parent or relative and have children at home still. So they're kind of getting squished a bit in the middle of that. So I think it's a really exciting time of life when people can look at their achievements and start thinking forward as to what else they want to achieve.
Absolutely. So if someone watching, Jane, is really struggling right now, perhaps they're not feeling fulfilled in what they do, maybe they don't know what they want, but they know that something's missing. They know there's more to life, but they're really not sure what it is. What advice would you give them?
I think I would advise the sort of time travel we talked about earlier. This may sound like a shock question, and I normally phrase it a bit more gently in a coaching conversation. But it's a really useful thing to do, which is to imagine yourself at the end of your life and think back, you know, what do you want people to be saying when you go? What mark do you want to leave on this earth? And it may be that you've reached the age of 50 or 60 and you have achieved that. Fantastic. But it's a time when we can think, well, what else could I squeeze in there? What else would I like to have tried? And it may not be other people. You know, what would you like to be able to say to yourself at the end? And is there anything that you would regret doing or not doing? And interestingly, if you read stuff by people who work with people in later life, so I can't remember her name, but there's a woman who runs a hospice who has written a book about her experience of people who are terminally ill. And she said all of them regret things they didn't do rather than regret things they did do. And, you know, we are here for a limited time. None of us know how long that is, but what a shame to actually feel sorry about something that you could have had a go at. And age doesn't seem to be such a barrier anymore to that, does it? I was reading the other day about a guy learning ballet in his 80s and is now teaching it in his 90s. So you think, well, you know, if he could do that, most of us, given reasonable health, achieve the things that we want to do. And a lot of it, I think it's interesting you started this conversation with talking about childhood and teenage years, that a lot of us had dreams and ambitions then that are the things that kind of come back sometimes in our 50s and 60s, you know, a hobby we dropped, or an ambition to try something that we had when we were 12 or something, and it kind of pops back up sometimes for people in their midlife, and I would be working with people to explore how they could go and do that.
I love that you've said all that. I really do. And that is such a great question. And personally, you know, I do want to make some sort of mark. I do want people to remember me for having made some sort of impact in the world. And that might not be everybody's thing, but I totally want to be on my deathbed feeling very proud of the life I've lived, and like I've kind of used every single drop of it.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm getting goosebumps just hearing you say that as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And that mark doesn't have to be, you know, climbing Everest or something, can it? It could just be that you've influenced your grandchildren in a particular way and left your mark that way, or friendships and, you know, all sorts of things can still be a legacy that you leave.
Absolutely, yeah. It's whatever is important to that person, isn't it? So that leads me into my final question, Jane. When you are no longer on this planet, how would you like people to remember you?
As a good friend, I think, and someone who provided support. I love seeing other people learn and develop. And I don't necessarily want to be the one who climbs Everest, but it would be lovely to see that someone I had coached had done the equivalent for them of that. So yeah, I would just like to be remembered as someone who was there and helped and supported people and left my mark that way, I guess.
Wonderful. So everybody, please just check out Jane's links below. But all there is for me to say, Jane, it's been wonderful talking to you. So thank you so much for sharing with us. So Jane Parslow, thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. They really got me thinking. Thank you.